moving on to next topic, we will talk about HTTP. HTTP stands for Hypertext Transfer Protocol. Okay, it is written over here, Hypertext Transfer Protocol. Okay, so what is HTTP? It is used to access data on World Wide Web. So whenever we are using internet, so HTTP helps us to access the data which is present on World Wide Web, or it can be any protocol, but in most of the cases you will find that HTTP is used. Okay, so HTTP works as a combination of FTP and SMTP. FTP and SMTP have been covered in previous chapters already. So it works as a combination. HTTP works as a combination of FTP and SMTP, and this is in terms of functionality. Okay, so it is similar to FTP because it transfers files and uses services of TCP. If you can remember, then FTP was using TCP. Okay, TCP connection. So similarly, HTTP also uses TCP, but there is one difference also. FTP used only one TCP connection. Sorry, FTP could use any number of TCP connections. Okay, but HTTP can use only one TCP connection. It uses only one TCP connection. Okay, so it is simpler than FTP. Simpler form. So you can also say that HTTP is a simpler form of FTP because uses only one TCP connection. Okay, and it is similar to SMTP because data transfer between client and servers looks like SMTP messages. So it is similar to SMTP because the data transferred between client and server, जो डेटा ट्रांसफर हो रहा है यहाँ पे वो किस फॉर्मेट में होता है, जैसे कि SMTP में जो मैसेजेस सेंड होते थे, so the in similar way here data is transferred. So this is similar to SMTP in this form, but it is unlike SMTP also. There is one difference also. So what is the difference? In SMTP, messages are easy to read, or we can say that we can read those messages. But in HTTP, when information is sent from client to server, these messages or data is in the form that only client and server can read it. Okay, we cannot read it. It is not in human readable form. So that was the difference between SMTP and HTTP. And what was the similarity? That the messages sent in SMTP and data sent in HTTP are sent in a similar way. Okay, so next is HTTP transaction. So HTTP transaction. So now let's talk about HTTP transaction. So what is HTTP transaction? So this transaction is initialized by the client by sending a request, and in reply server responds. So look at this image. So in this image, if you can see that there is a client and there is a server. Okay, so what is client doing? Client is sending a request message to the server, and in response server is sending the response message to the client. So this is the transaction which is taking place, and this transaction is initialized when client sends the request and in reply server responds. So this is HTTP transaction. So now we will look in detail about the format of this request message and this response message in detail. Okay, just give me a moment. So request message. So in request message we have three parts. First is request line. This is the first line in the request message. Then second line we have header lines, and third line is body. So what is request line? Request line is the first line and it is divided into three parts: method, URL and version. So method and URL are divided by space. If you can see, here is a space. So method and URL are divided by space, URL and version are also divided by space, and this request line is ended by CR and LF. What is CR? CR stand for carriage return. And line LF stand for line field. We don't need to go into detail of these terms. Just know that request line is ended by CR and LF, which is carriage return and line field. So that's all you need to know. So now let's talk about the three parts which are included in the request line. So what are these three parts? First is the method, second is URL, and third is the version. So what is method? So method defines request type. So what type of request the client has, it defines that type of request. Okay, this is defined by method field. Method field defines the request. Then we have the URL. URL defines address and name of the corresponding web page. So when client is sending the request to the server, it already sends the URL with it, so that server can locate that web page using this URL. Okay, so this is stored in the URL field. The next field is version. Version gives the version of the protocol which has been used. So in most cases the protocol is HTTP, and we are studying HTTP transaction only, so this will be HTTP only. And the version for HTTP which is stored nowadays and generally is 1.1. So version field will contain the value 1.1. URL will contain the address, which is the unique resource locator, which we have already covered, and method will contain the type of the request that client has. Okay, so next is header lines. What is header line? So when a client is sending a request to the server and it wants to add some additional information with it, so it uses header lines. So it is not necessary that header line will be present. If there is no additional request, then there will be no header line, but there can be n number of header lines. That means that there can be an additional information with the request. Okay, so we can have 0 or more request header. So it depends on the additional information or additional request which the client wants to add. So it can be 0 or more. Okay, it contains additional information. Okay, and what we mean by additional information? So let's read this example. Client requests the document in a special format. So there was a web page which client has requested from the server, but it says that I want this in this specific format. So this is the additional information. So this will be added in the using header lines. Okay, so this was about header line. Now talking about its format. So header line contains a header name separated by colon and one space field, and then we have value. So there are two main things, header name and value separated by colon and space. And header lines are also ended with carriage field and line feed. So we just need to remember, we don't even need to remember this is of no use, but you should know that header lines are ended with carriage return and line feed, and don't get into it, it is of no use. So it contains header names, colon, space and a value. So the important part is header name and value. So what will header name contain and what will value contain? Let's look at this table. Let me clean the board. So if you can see here, then we have a header name. We have a header name here and a value in the header line. Okay. So let's say that the client wants to add date to the field, to the web page. So in header name he will add date, and in value he will say that show the current date. So this is what header name and value signifies. According to the need he can change the header line. Now next field is body. So what is the use of the body part is in the request message format. So body is a variable number of lines. So body may be present. It is not necessary that body is present. It is optional. So it contains comment to be sent. So anything that clients want to send to the server, any comment that will be added in the body part, and it is not necessary that it will be present. It is an optional part. So this was about the request message format. I hope that this is clear. So we have request message. Now let's move on to the response message. So response message, again it is divided in mainly in three parts. What are the three parts? Status line, header lines and body part. So what is status line? It is also divided into three fields: version, status code and phrase. Okay, version defines the version of the HTTP protocol, which is 1.1 most of the times. So version field contains 1.1 value. Then we have status code. It defines status of the request in 3 digits. And then phrase explains the status code in text form. Let's talk about this more. So we say that status code is a 3-digit number and phrase explains that 3-digit number. Okay, so look at this table. So these are the status codes. It will, as it is a 3-digit number, so it will vary from 100 to at most 999. So it is a 3-digit number, what status code, and phrase will explain what that status code means. These are the phrase, and this is a description for that phrase. So phrase will only contain these values. Okay, so and there is one more special thing about these codes, that these are divided into different range. That 100 to 200 range will define a particular type, and what will be that particular type? That it will contain some information about the page, and then from 200 to 300 it will contain some information about the success. Let's say that status code contains 202 value. Then phrase will contain accepted. So what does this represent is that the request has been accepted successfully. So this was about the status code and phrase. So now next part is header lines. So again, header lines is exactly similar to what we have seen in request message. It has header name, it was header name here, it is header name here, then these separated by colon and a space, colon and a space, and then we had value, and the line ended with carriage return and line feed. So these are exactly same. So whatever additional information the client is sending, server is receiving that and adding it to the response message. So our next part is the body part. So if you remember that in request message, this can either contain some information or some comment, but it was not necessary that it will contain something. But in response message, it will not be empty, it will contain the web page which the client has requested from this server, and in only one case it will be empty or not contain anything, and that case will be when there is an error in the web page, error message. So we can even read this part. So contains document to be sent. The document which is to be sent will be contained here. And then present unless the response is an error message. So body will always contain something unless there is an error message. Otherwise there will be always something present. And what will be that something? That will be the web page which was requested. So this was about the response format. So I hope this is clear. Let's quickly revise it up. So what did it say? HTTP transaction. So there was transaction. A client was sending a request message to the server and server was replying with a response message. Then we have discussed about the format of request message and the response message. There were three field: headers, request line and body, and in the response message there was status line, headers and the body. In request message, request line was just telling that what kind of request it is making. There was method, version and one more format which was URL. It was containing URL. And then we had status line which contained version, status code and phrase. And in header these two were exactly same. And in body part there was it could be empty, or it was not necessary that the request message will contain something, but response message contained the web page. But in case of an error message, it was empty. So this was all about HTTP transaction. I hope this makes sense. Thank you. So the next topic is conditional requests. So what is the conditional request? So there is a client and he is making a request to the server. Okay. And with that request, client adds a condition that if this condition is satisfied, and then server checks this condition. If this condition is met, then server returns this web page to the client. Otherwise, it will not return anything. So when client adds addition in the request, it is called as conditional request. Server checks the condition. Server is checking condition, and if the condition is met, then requested web page is sent. Okay. So let's say that server is asking for a page, and he says that if this page was modified since yesterday, if this page was modified yesterday, then I need this page. This was the condition. Now server will check if that page was modified yesterday, and if that page was modified only yesterday, then he will return the page. Otherwise, he will not return it. So this was about conditional requests. So now next topic is persistence. So in persistence, we have discussed about two connections, non-persistent connection and persistent connection. So in persistent connection, it requires connection setup again and again for each request to send. So let's understand this with this image. So there is a client and he is making a establishment request. He is making a request for a web page. Then with that request, what will happen? Connection establishment request will also be sent. So that connection is established and they can communicate. Who they? Client and server. Okay. So connection has been set up. Then server is responding with the response to the client. Then client has read this file and connection has been terminated. So at this point, connection has been terminated. But now client again needs a file. So again connection establishment request has been sent and along with the request of the page. So web page then server respond again and then connection is terminated again when the response was received by the client. And third time again this process goes on. So what is happening in this case is that setup connection is setting up again and again for each request to send. It requires connection setup again and again for each request to send. Okay, सेटअप हो रहा है यहाँ पे टर्मिनेट हो गया, फिर सेटअप टर्मिनेशन सेटअप एंड टर्मिनेशन. But in persistent connection, it does not require setup again and again for each request to send. Initially, there was connection establishment here, and with this, the request for the web page was sent. Then server responded it to the client with the web page. Then there was no connection establishment request this time. Only the request for the web page was there. But here we can see that connection establishment request along with the request for the web page. So we are not setting up the connection again and again in this case. Only we are responding and requesting the web page. And at last the transaction has been terminated. So this was about persistent and non-persistent connection. Now next topic is cookies. So what is cookies? So today web pages have many functions. What are these functions? It is used in today web pages are used as e-shopping, electronic stores, for registered clients, as portals, and even for advertising. And for these all different purposes, we need cookies. So how do we create and store cookies? When a server receives a request from a client, it stores information about the client in a file or a string. So there was a client and there was a server. When a server receives a request from a client, a request was made. It stores information about the client in a file or a string. So there can be some information along with this request. That information is stored in a string, and that string is called as cookie. This cookie which is made by server using the request and the information sent along with this request. So what can this information be? This can be a URL, this can be name, this can be password, this can be timestamp, and etc. This can be anything. So storing this information in a string is a cookie. Then server includes the cookie in the response. And when the server replies the client with the web page, it includes the cookie in the response. So that when the client receives the response, the browser stores the cookie in the cookie directory. So there is a cookie directory on the client side. So when the response is received at the client side, this cookie is stored in this cookie directory, which is stored by the domain server name. So what was domain server name? We remember that www something was the domain server name. So this is how cookie has been generated. Why is it called cookie? Because it is generated by server and it is eaten by client. So this is why it is called as cookie. So now next part is the uses of cookies. So we said that there are several functions of the web pages nowadays for e-shopping, for registered clients, portals, advertising, and for these purposes we need cookies. But how are we using them in these purposes? We can know about them. So while we shop, when we shop, let's say there was item 1 and we added this to our cart. So now cookie has been updated in this case with the item number or anything, item name. Now we added another item in the cart. Now the cookie has been again updated with this item number. Similarly, this happens n times. So every time a item has been added to the cart, so our cookie is getting updated. So in this case, this way our cookie has been used for registered clients. So how do we use it for registered clients? So let's say we are registering on a website for the first time. So while registering for the first time, there was some information which was stored in the cookie. Let's say name and password. So when I will come again on this site and access it, then cookie will be matched and I will be allowed the access. But the users whose cookies will be not matched will not be allowed the access. So for such reasons, in this case, we can use cookie in this way. Similarly, we can use for portals and in advertising also. How does it is used for advertising? So it uses our data to store information, and then whatever ads we see are derived from that data only on other websites. So it also raises question on the privacy, and several times changes have been made in the policies, but still there are some ways that our privacy is hindered. So cookie has many controversies with it. So this was all about cookies in this video, and next is web caching and proxy servers. So what is web caching and proxy server? We have talked about this above also in previous video, that server uses a cache memory. So it is similar to that only. So when there is a client and there is a server, and client is again and again making a request to the server, similar request, then instead of server responding to that request again and again, there is an intermediate called proxy server. So what does this proxy server does is, let's say there was a new request sent to the server and server responded to that request. Now while responding it, proxy server will copy that response in its memory, so that when client again requests that page, proxy server can deal with that response, with that request on its own, rather than disturbing the server again and again. So it acts as an intermediate between client and server. So it is acting as an intermediate between client and the server to reduce the load on the server. So this way server can handle other problems once it has been sorted, to not deal with the problems which he has dealt already. So with those problems, now proxy server can deal. Stores copies of all the responses of the server. So whatever response he will send, proxy server will store all those responses. If there is a new request, then it forwards. But if there is a new request, client is making a new request, then proxy server will read that request and it will see that he has not response for this request, so it will forward this request to the server. And when server will reply, then it will copy the response and forward this response to the client. So this was about proxy servers. So there are two more things about proxy server that we need to discuss. First is the location. Where are these located? So these are generally located near the site, client site. So these are generally located at the client site. But we can read some of the cases. Suppose that a client computer can also be used as a proxy server in small capacity that stores and responses to requests invoked by the client. Suppose there is a client and in his computer there is a proxy server, so that instead of making the request to the server again and again, its own computer can handle the request. Okay, but in a company there is a proxy server may be installed to reduce the pressure on computer LAN. So in company there can be a different way of doing this task. And similarly in ISP. So what is ISP? Internet Service Provider. So many customer can install a proxy server to reduce the load going out and coming out of the ISP network, as a lot of requests will be made to the ISP, Internet Service Provider. So to reduce that load, we can use proxy server here. So it just depends on where it can be used and where it should be used on the situation. There is no fixed point regarding where it can be located, what proxy servers. So now how are these proxy servers updated? I mean, there is a client, he's making request to the server, and there is a proxy server, and this proxy server is copying all the requests. So in order, and when he will copy all these requests, it will contain a lot of information. So how is that information updated? Because it cannot keep on storing the things. So there will be a point when this information needs to be updated. So for how long should proxy server store the copies of a response? So that totally depends on the situation. It depends, and for that we use different strategies. So let's say there is a news page, so proxy server can save the news page early in the morning and discard it next day. So that if there are clients making requests for the news page on that day, he can handle that. It can handle it. And there can be weekly updation. There is a task which is just needed updated weekly, so there can be weekly updation, there can be monthly updation, yearly. So it completely depends on the situation, and different strategies are used for it. There is nothing specific. So but proxy server needs to be updated, it cannot keep on storing the things. So this was all about proxy servers. Next and last topic in this video would be HTTP security. So HTTP does not provide any type of security, but if run over SSL, secure socket layer. But if HTTP is run over SSL, this layer, then it can provide some security, and in that case HTTP will be called as HTTPS. Okay, and in this case this will provide some confidentiality, and client and server will be authenticated and data will be integrated. There will be some authentication and data will be integrated. There will be data integrity. So this was all in this video.